Yes, well, thanks everybody for joining me today. I can't see you out there, so I have to pretend you're there. Way back when I was teaching the early part of my career, I did something called ITV, which was standing in a room in front of a TV camera. That was back in the days when they broadcast classes via some sort of TV network. So I've got to kind of slip back into that mode here and imagine that you're out there, the audience, eagerly awaiting some hopefully useful information from me. So I'll jump right in. Again, my name is Mike Kimball, and I am an anthropologist, University of Northern Colorado. I'm also a certified mindfulness teacher, and for some of you that makes sense, or you understand what that means, and for others of you, you don't. I can provide more information on mindfulness as a practice and as an approach in this presentation, but that's not really what the presentation is about today. So I'm open to any questions you might ask along the way that you want to share with Ryan, and then I can touch on those as we at the very end of the presentation. I wanted to explain that picture that you see on the left side of your screen to sort of capture the essence of this presentation. That picture was actually painted by one of my students while I was writing my book. So no, actually that's a weak attempt at a joke. That's an alchemist, and I draw on that picture because there's this sense of transformation that can happen when you take things that normally don't come together, like lead that's turned into gold, and it's a similar kind of concept, or a great metaphor to be thinking about when we talk about cultural discomfort zones. So why don't I just jump right into the rest of this, and we'll take it from there. This is a picture of my book. What I'm talking about today is based on the book published by Kendall Hunt. And the title is Ethno-Wise, Embracing Culture Shock to Build Resilience, Responsiveness, and Connection. So once again, the ideas that I'm going to be sharing with you today are based on that book. The book itself draws on findings from anthropology, psychology, neuroscience, and some other areas to reveal what I call the matrix of culture, drawing on another metaphor, that movie that some of you might be familiar with back in 1999 called The Matrix, when there was a story around a main character, a hero, who had to find a way to break out of a matrix created by machine overlords. So when I talk about culture, I'm not really saying that we're all actually in a simulation created by machine overlords, but it is a great metaphor because when we look at culture as something that constructs a reality for us, and that we experience our lives through it, and take it completely for granted, like fish would take water for granted, I suppose. It gives us kind of some insights into understanding culture and understanding our relationship to it, and how we can benefit by engaging with culture shock rather than resisting it. So culture shock it happens when we're encountering the culturally unfamiliar, and I'll talk about that a bit more with regard to cultural discomfort zones. Also, I want to mention or re-mention, I guess, that Ryan has sent out to you a PDF which contains really a chunk of the last part of this book in it that kind of walks you through, provides some guidelines and some perspectives to walk you through what I call an ethno-wise path. And that is to say, a series of ways of engaging with cultural discomfort zones that all connect up to each other. So if you see the cover of that book there in front of you, that diagram in the very middle is what I'm talking about with the path. And so you'll have that, if you don't have it open in front of you, which you don't need to, you can refer to it later, and it'll probably make a little bit more sense out of what I'm saying at the end of this presentation with regard to that particular path. Also, Ryan's going to be sending out to you a link to an e-poster, and I had that as a bit of an incentive for folks who wanted to register for for today's webinar. And what it does is basically distills all of the principles and tools and insights and other kinds of concepts in the book into a sort of pictorial representation. So that'll give you a chance to kind of, I don't know, peruse the different concepts that you might find in the book, and also connect it up to what you're hearing today in the webinar. So this is the territory we're going to cover today. We're going to look at about 5 different things. The first one is what is a cultural discomfort zone? So I'm going to briefly explain what I mean by that. Another one is how do we react to CDZs, cultural discomfort zones? Third one is what good is a CDZ? Fourth, how do you get the most from your CDZs? And fifth, how do you engage with them? And sixth, we'll have some Q&A at the end. So I'm talking about you, the proverbial you in this presentation, but for those of you who are educators, what you're of course really thinking about is your students. But those of us who do this kind of work realize that we have to practice what we preach, so to speak, as well. So this is an invitation to all of us, whether we're a teacher or student, and I would argue that we are always both in life, to explore these kinds of dimensions before we take them live, if you will, to our student populations. So we'll start with what is a cultural discomfort zone. And the easy definition for that would be, any experience outside your comfort zone that's culturally conditioned. And for my students, I like to create a comparison between what I would call a personal discomfort zone and a cultural discomfort zone, because the two are obviously they overlap, but there are important differences. And so when we're talking about a cultural discomfort zone, we're talking about something that is that we are conditioned to not inherently understand as a result of our enculturation, as a result of the way we were brought up, the communities that we lived in, the geography that we grew up in, the values of our families and our nations and things like that. And so we have a particular way, as I talked about with the metaphor of the matrix, a particular way of looking at the world and interpreting it and perceiving it that is conditioned strongly by our cultural values and the practices that we're familiar with and so forth. So a personal discomfort zone is more like, I'm afraid of heights, let's say. And so when I climb a ladder, I'm not comfortable at the top, right? So that's personal. That doesn't necessarily have a cultural component. It can, but it doesn't necessarily have one. Whereas if I'm hanging out with rock climbers who spend as much time as possible climbing sheer cliffs, then I'm both in a personal discomfort zone because I don't like heights, but I'm also in a cultural discomfort zone because there are values, there are ways of looking at the world, there's ways of understanding experience that are completely foreign to me, that belong to those who spend their lives rock climbing. So you can see the differences between the two, and you can see how they overlap in that kind of example. The definition that I'd give you is this: an encounter with the culturally unfamiliar that your brain perceives as a threat. And I think it's important to focus on that word threat, and to also consider what would our brain consider to be a threat. And so I'm gonna move into that realm next with the next slide. So the next thing I'm going to share with you comes from some work by a social psychologist by the name of Walter Steffen and his colleagues. And it's based on it. It isn't a complete explication or exposition of his theory, which is called intergroup threat theory. It's also been renamed integrated threat theory. I draw on it pretty heavily in the first part of the book to explain the situation with culture shock and with cultural discomfort zones. So I've incorporated it into an infographic, which is also part of the book. And I use it to explain a little bit more about what I mean about our brains perceiving threats. So let me, that's the reference if you're interested in the work done by Walter Steffen and his colleagues. But I'll start with the first part of the infographic, and then we'll kind of work our way through it. So the first part, or two parts really, is your intercultural encounter. And I think I want to emphasize at this point that when I'm talking about intercultural, I don't necessarily mean that your students or yourself is interacting with someone from another formally defined cultural group, for instance, traveling to another part of the world and interacting with people in their own country. That certainly is an intercultural experience or an intercultural encounter, but it doesn't have to be that complicated or that egregious, leaving your place of the place you live and traveling to another part of the globe. Instead, it could be just somebody next door. It could be somebody in your workplace. It could be a student in your classroom, who shares or has a different set of values than the ones you're familiar with and the ones you were raised to share with others like you. And I guess I want to reemphasize something when I say that and bring up that metaphor of the matrix again. Honestly, when you're in that kind of a matrix, as it's shown in the movie, and when you think about a fish in water, you don't really pay attention to the matrix itself. You just see the world through it. You perceive the world through it, through all of your senses. And so that means that in some way, the information that's coming in is being modulated to some extent by your expectations, by the perceptions that have been conditioned by your cultural values and your history. And so when you're encountering somebody from another so-called cultural world, cultural matrix, you're coming into contact with somebody who may be perceiving the world in very, very different ways than you yourself do. So you can imagine, again, the classroom with students from different backgrounds coming in there. They're all human. We're all human. But culture plays a rather large role in conditioning what our expectations are and how we're going to be interacting with other people. And so this is what I mean when I talk about the encounter. It doesn't, again, have to be an extreme kind of encounter. It could be just something that seems perfectly normal in a condition that where you're expecting things to be as you understand them. You are, working within your cultural norms and have no expectation of it being different. And then all of a sudden you encounter somebody who has a very different point of view and very different perceptions. So the antecedents of threat are part of the intergroup threat theory that Walter Steffens and his collaborators have come up with. And I won't spend a lot of time on this. I'm happy to unpack it further for those who want to ask me about it later on. But really, there are four antecedents. In other words, four things that you're bringing. Think of it as, baggage, if you will. I don't mean to assign a negative value to that, but some kind of baggage you're bringing into your encounter. And so one of those things is intergroup relations. And what that means is there's history. There's history sometimes and oftentimes between your group, your in-group, and somebody else's in-group. And you personally may know nothing of that history. But you certainly will encounter the experience of relating to or trying to relate or interrelating with somebody who might grasp that history. So we can think about that, with current things that are happening in the world today, certainly in the United States, but also elsewhere, when different groups of people or individuals that represent, even if they don't think they do, represent an entire group, an entire history, coming in contact with somebody else with a different one. And that can strongly condition the nature of the interaction. And I'll just let you use your own experience or your own knowledge to reflect on specific examples that might fit that. And again, happy to spell that out more at the end of the presentation if you have specific questions. Cultural dimensions is just really, it's the cultural matrix. That's what I call the cultural matrix. And it's really a catch-all category for values and for perceptions and for standards of practice and just the things that we grew up with that condition our experience. Those also we bring into our encounters with other people. Situational factors are also very interesting because you might think, well, you might think at first glance that when you're interacting with another person, it could be anywhere. You could be, in your backyard. You could be in a classroom. You could be standing on another planet, and it's all the same. But actually, it isn't. Those situational factors, the physical environment, the way the room is structured, even the quality of light coming in, all those kinds of things condition the encounter itself too. And you have oftentimes very little control over those. So they're there, you walk into it, and you're relating or trying to relate to another human being while those factors are at play, those structural factors, if you want to call them that. And finally, we have individual difference variables, and this is the psychology part of it. This is, am I an introvert? Am I an extrovert? Do I have a sense of openness to experience, or am I kind of closed? Am I a curious person? All of those, and then there's, the big five psychological, variables that people talk about when they talk about personality. All those kinds of things are obviously going to come into play when we're having an intercultural encounter, but they're also going to come into play in terms of shaping whether our brains perceive something as a threat or not. Here's the second half of the diagram. Oh, there's three halves. Three halves. There are 3/3 to that diagram, and the next slide will have the last third. But here I want to pay attention to two aspects. One is what I call the sensorium, and this is drawn from medical science, actually. And so if you think about the ways that your brain understands the world, you end up thinking of your five senses, really. There are other senses that we need to consider, but I won't go into them in any great detail. But if you think of us having a sensorium, that there's sensors all over our body and within our body that read data, if you will, from the world to help our brains construct a model of it. So the take-home point here is that our brains can't directly experience the world at all. Our brains are locked in a dark box inside our heads. And so the only way our brain can make sense of what's going on in the world is to pull data through senses and then create models for how that world works and predict. There's some great work done by Anil Seth, who's a neuroscientist in Britain. He's got a great TED talk. You just Google his name, Seth, Anil, A-N-I-L, Seth, S-E-T-H. You'll see this great presentation on the work that they're doing on how the brain isn't really directly perceiving the world. Instead, it's constantly building predictive models of the world, because again, it can't directly experience it. So it's pulling data from touch. It's pulling it from eyes, ears, and that sort of thing. But it's also pulling it from inside. So if you're sitting there in your chair and you notice, maybe if you're in the right time zone right now, it could be lunchtime, and maybe you're eating your sandwich or eating your soup or salad or whatever it is right now while you're listening to me. Or maybe you've held off on that temptation until after the presentation to go grab your lunch. And so you'll notice different things happening in your body. It isn't something you can see, and it isn't really the sense of touch. It's more like you just have a sense of things moving around inside your body. Also, where your body is in space, right? So you know that you're not upside down unless you're on an inversion table while watching this presentation, which would be a fascinating way to do it. But chances are you're sitting in a chair, or who knows where you are, but your body's position in space, and that's another way, that's another sense that our organism has for reading data from the world and making sense out of it. But again, the brain is a modeling device, if you want to simplify it that way. And so it really isn't fully aware of what's going on outside, and it's trying its best to figure it out. And that's when we get to this idea of threat. So Stefan and his coworkers have boiled it down to two kinds of threats that our brains perceive in the world. One is called a realistic threat, and that's the tiger in the underbrush that's lurking out there, and where the tiger will eat you. So that's a realistic threat. Or stepping out in a street and a bus is heading toward you. That is a realistic threat. Also, threats, he includes that to mean also threats to your livelihood. So survival related threats, not necessarily life and death, but will I be able to pay, have the money to pay for food tomorrow? Those are realistic threats. But there's also symbolic threats, and those are threats, instead of to livelihood, let's say it's threat to lifeway. to worldview. So the thing is our brain can't really tell the difference between those two different kinds of threat. They feel scary, whether it's our life that's being threatened or our way of life that's being threatened. And so while our brain can't tell the difference between them, they are extremely important for us to understand the difference cognitively between them, and then to learn to differentiate between them, to teach our brain a few things about what's real and what's symbolic. So I want to focus on the symbolic threat, because when we're talking about culture, that's where, in culture shock and entering cultural discomfort zones, that's where the threats really exist. Granted, you could go to a place where you are in danger, physically in danger. You could go to a place where you can't find a job, and so you're experiencing realistic threats. Yes, that's entirely possible. But for our purposes, we are interested in cultural discomfort zones that produce the other kind of threat, produce the symbolic threat. So there's that part of the diagram again. And I will, I hope I'm not talking too quickly here. So if anybody wants to kind of message Ryan now and say, tell that guy to slow down, or if the pace is okay, then that's great. Getting any feedback, Ryan?
Yeah, it sounds like it's going well.
Okay.
Good pace.
All right, great. Nice to hear. All right, then I'll keep rolling here. So you got your sensorium. These are the sensors that are pulling data from the world. And when you're entering a CDZ, you've got your brain reacting to a threat. Your brain is becoming alert to that threat. It doesn't know the difference between realistic and symbolic, so you're having a reaction. So people who have studied mammals, and certainly humans are mammals, have found that there's four, some people say five, but I'm gonna focus on 4 ways that we react to threat. So this diagram here shows you that there's an output from the realistic threat and symbolic threat into the same zone that causes reaction. So this is the last part of the infographic right here, reactions. And I'm sure a lot of you have heard of that sort of, freeze, fight, flight kind of thing. There's also something called fright, which I'll explain in a second. When you think about a typical mammal, some kind of, I don't know, in the top picture, there's a deer there. When you think about that animal is going to react very basically, very instinctively to different kinds of threats. I don't think there are too many animal species out there besides humans who experience symbolic threats, but I am going to say the jury's out on that, as we don't know enough about mammalian intelligence, or even bird intelligence for that matter, to be conclusive about that. But this presentation's about human culture today, so we won't go into that gray zone too much. But I'll kind of emphasize here that we have very human reactions that follow these four basic kinds of instinctual reactions. In other words, there's a human version of each of these, and they show up in different ways. So freeze, you could look at that as hypervigilance. So if you've ever been in a situation, I hope you haven't, but if you've ever been in a situation where you're really frightened and it's late at night and you're in a parking lot or something, and you hear a noise that could be dangerous, could be a realistic threat, you stop and your senses become heightened and you're listening, and every sound of a footfall or a crunching twig or anything like that, a shutting car door, is suddenly very, very relevant to you. So you're not running away yet, you're just standing there listening and trying to understand on some deep level. Your brain's trying to figure out if what you're about to encounter is a realistic threat. So freeze is something that we humans do. We literally freeze, but also we freeze in other ways when we're confronted by symbolic threats. We freeze cognitively. We just, stop and listen and don't think. There's a moment of just just observation, of hypervigilance cognitively. We have different thoughts associated with that. We have different body postures, and it's interesting to pay attention to those. So sometimes our first reaction is just to freeze and become hypervigilant. But also there's the fight reaction. Certainly, that's something that humans engage in way too much. But it doesn't have to be violence either. It can be fight with words. It can be fight with the thoughts that occur in your mind around a situation. Imagine stepping into a cultural discomfort zone and immediately feeling defensive, right? Feeling like you are being accosted in some way or assaulted in some way by somebody else's value system. It's an interesting thing to contemplate. And that means that the thoughts that occur in your mind might be aggressive thoughts, or your body reactions, your body posture might reflect an aggressive stance. So that's one of the possibilities after freeze is, and it depends, if we go back to the antecedents, it depends on the situation, depends on the intergroup characteristics, what kind of historical baggage, if you will, that you're bringing into the situation, your cultural dimensions, and of course, your personal psychological setup. Whether you're an aggressive person or a submissive person is to some extent determined by, your lived experience and your genetics and your personality and so forth. So fight is certainly an option, and we experience it as humans. We can experience it differently than I think a lot of other animals do. It's not just necessarily straight out physical violence. Third one is flight. And by flight, of course, I mean running away. Now, what's interesting about this is with human beings, we can run away without actually moving our bodies, right? We can run away from a situation by completely avoiding thinking about it or dealing with it. Denial is something we human beings are very good at. And so there are many different ways that flight manifests in human reactions to symbolic threat within cultural discomfort zones. And so it's, again, interesting to contemplate. In the book, Ethnowise, I have an infographic that kind of has a provisional map, if you will, of a lot of different kinds of reactions that we humans engage in when we're encountering these particular possibilities. So flight is something interesting. Flight can happen in your head as well as in your body. And the rest of your body. Our heads are connected. They are part of our bodies. And the last one is fright, and that, if you don't know your natural history as well as you might, is an opossum. And they are known. I grew up in New England. That is the New England that's on the East Coast of the United States. And we had opossums there, and they're fascinating little creatures because when they're frightened, when they feel threatened, they act dead. It's called catatonic immobility. They'll just drop dead. Humans don't do that too often, although, somebody can faint from fright for sure. But we have reactions in our bodies and in our minds that kind of mimic or kind of are parallel to that kind of fright response. So sometimes if you feel yourself being submissive in a situation where you're giving up, that you may not be physically giving up as in falling over, but you may be emotionally giving up, or you may be intellectually giving up. So it's interesting to think about the human manifestations of these very basic mammalian reactions. And once again, going back a little bit, our brains really have a hard time, unconsciously recognizing the difference between realistic threat and symbolic threat. We basically have to teach our brains to develop a model that differentiates the two. That's part of our challenge as human beings. Okay, move on to the next thing. So the next question is, what good is a CDZ? Because if you're feeling threatened, that usually isn't a good feeling, and you want to get away from that feeling. And that's the way we humans are. We're neurobiologically and usually culturally conditioned to avoid pain and pursue pleasure. So that means that anything that asks us to embrace something that we perceive as a threat seems like a really bad idea. So if that tiger's waiting for me in the bushes and it jumps out and I want to give it a hug, that just seems like a really bad idea. And my brain is not neurobiologically set up to have that be the first idea that occurs. Oh, tiger, big hug. Instead, it's more like, get out of here, or if I'm capable, fight back, or something like that. So, so we are not set up for embracing discomfort. We're just not. And as human beings, we avoid it as often as possible. Especially, this is a little editorial comment, but especially in the West, and in particular in the United States, I think there's a lot of cultural conditioning around avoiding any kind of discomfort. And you might even say it's gotten to be epidemic proportions. We could talk about that if you have any questions or want to make your own comments at the end. But I think we're in an interesting time. We're living in interesting times right now, where discomfort is something more aversive maybe than it's ever been, or there've probably been swings in time about more or less aversion to discomfort. So we are not in a time period right now where people are really embracing it. I think that's a fair summary. So therefore, it's kind of counterintuitive to us that we could benefit from turning toward discomfort rather than rejecting it. And then from the standpoint of education, you know, what we're doing as educators, or when we're learners, that's especially important. So I'm going to give you a little quote here from a gentleman who's was an ecologist, and his way of putting it, I learned it when I was in college, and has sort of stuck with me all these years, and I think it's a great summary, so here it is. When your views and your intellect are being challenged, and you begin to feel uncomfortable because of a contradiction you've detected that is threatening your current model of the world, pay attention. You're about to learn something. So I think this is the message here for all of us, whether we're teachers or students or anything in between, that actually discomfort is a teacher. And it can be one of the most powerful and influential teachers in our lives. But it depends on what we're doing with it, right? If we're running away from it, it's not as good a teacher as when we're turning toward it. So my argument, and the argument in my book, is that the more we cultivate an attitude and a practice around embracing cultural discomfort, the more we're going to learn, the more resilient we're going to become, and the more connection we're going to be able to make with other people, with other human beings who are different from us, and from whom we probably have a lot to learn. So now we get into the question of, how do you get the most from your CDZs? And this is where I draw on the work of Yuefang Zhou, who's a psychologist, and her colleagues. They published a research paper that was focused on study abroad experiences, which of course connect up rather well to this topic. But again, much like what I did with Walter Steffen and his colleagues' work, I'm pulling from that, but I'm kind of manipulating it myself to have it align better with the larger picture of the argument that I'm trying to make. So this is where I introduce the idea of the ABCs. And this, I think, is a simple but very powerful tool for engaging with cultural discomfort. And there's another infographic in my book, which I'll show you right here. That's the reference if you want it. That really lays out what that territory looks like. A stands for affect. For psychologists, this oftentimes means emotions, but it's very important, and there's a lot of good neuroscience around this, that we should connect it up to feelings as well. Feelings just mean bodily sensations. Because it turns out that we as human beings, while we have bodily sensations, and all of us probably experience similar ones, the meaning that we assign to them can be culturally conditioned, can be actually different by whatever culture you're in. So emotions, I would define as the meaning that we assign to the actual bodily feelings that we're having as a result of, in this case, stepping into a cultural discomfort zone. So that's affect. Behavior is speech and action, a little bit of a provocative symbol there for the action icon. And what this means is, and again, in a cultural discomfort zone, we act. We find ourselves acting. We might act through body language. That would be action. We might act through, direct contact with another human being, or avoiding contact with another human being. That's behavior, that's action. Or we might be saying things. Sometimes the things we say get us into trouble. Sometimes the things we say are meant to avoid discomfort. Whatever it is, those two aspects of behavior are key elements to unpacking the experience of being in a cultural discomfort zone. Also key components to making meaning from that experience, learning from it, and actually achieving the full benefits from engaging with it. So the last one is C for cognition, and those are the thoughts that occur. There are some traditions in the world, cultural traditions in the world, that say we don't have five senses, smelling, hearing, seeing, touching. There's one other one. What is it? Smell? No, I already said that one. Whatever that one that I just missed is.
Tasting?
What was that?
Was it tasting?
There you go, tasting. Thank you, Ryan. That's a perfect thing to say around lunchtime here in my part of the world anyway. So there are some cultural traditions that suggest there are six senses we have, and by that I don't mean that we can see ghosts. I mean that instead we have minds, and our minds are constantly churning out thoughts. And if you pay some attention to your mind, and this is where that mindfulness piece comes in, you start to notice that your mind is churning out thoughts all the time. During every waking moment, you're having some conversation with yourself, some running commentary about your experience. And once you start paying attention to that, then it opens up a world of inquiry into your reaction to and your processing of cultural discomfort. So when you put the ABCs together and you learn to study them as a package, to unpack that package and explore each one, you start to learn a tremendous amount, and thus you're better able to manage those situations. So let's talk a little bit about engaging with cultural discomfort now. As we're getting towards the end of the presentation, and I wanted to give some reasonably concrete examples, and then to explore that path that I was telling you about, that you have your PDF around. My border collie just walked into the room. He's very quiet. Okay. I don't know. He's not experiencing any cultural discomfort right now. So when we talk about engaging with CDZs, I wanted to mention that there was a person who may be with us today who sent in a question right away to Ryan around this presentation. She teaches in an elementary school, K through 5, and was interested in knowing whether this has any relevance to really young kids. And I think that's an amazing question. And the answer is that, like with anything that we do for older students, things have to be changed to recognize the developmental stages that human beings are in at different points in their lives. So the answer that I would give to somebody who's teaching college students would be, I think, quite different than the answer I would give to somebody who's teaching a kindergartner. The benefit of being a kindergartner is that you aren't fully enculturated yet. And so you're still very open to experience. Granted, you're going to be taking in your own personality variables and things like that into the mix. That's going to modulate how you're encountering things. But you're much more open, I think, in general. The downside of that is that you're more easily frightened. Your brain is not trained yet to fully grasp what a threat is and what a threat is not. Excuse me. So we have to be, of course, very gentle with young children in terms of introducing the idea of cultural discomfort. So I want to address that when I get to a specific example that I'm about to give. And then again, I open this up to people's feedback and their questions and so forth when we get towards the end of the presentation. So I'm going to give you some examples here for ways to engage with cultural discomfort zones. And all of you are in a particular situation where some of these might be relevant and others might certainly not be. But cherry pick, feel free to cherry pick as you see fit, and also to contemplate your own examples that might diverge from these or that might complement them. So the first one that I want to introduce is food. If there's probably no, in my experience anyway, probably no better way, and I talk about this in my book, no better way to experience culture shock than through food. You discover so much about your enculturation when you're confronted by someone else's food, what they consider delicious, you might find nauseating. This is and if there's anybody from Vietnam or from a Vietnamese background who's watching this might look delicious to you because this is a Vietnamese dish. It includes rather large larvae, cooked larvae in a soup, probably a pho type soup. And you know, to be totally honest, that does not look appealing to me because I didn't grow up in that kind of background. But my engagement with it is going to teach me tremendous amounts about my culture and about my situation and about somebody else's cultural matrix. So it's a brilliant way. Food is a brilliant way to engage ourselves in that exploration. Also, we have, in this case, you know, I'm dealing with the United States in this picture. We have, you know, your donkey and your elephant, which for our international folks may or may not be familiar as representing the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Anybody who follows the news knows that those two parties are not really getting along very well right now. Worse than ever, probably. But so when I do these kinds of things with my students, and they come to me and they say, I don't know what any CDZs are, I suggest that they take a close look at their upbringing, what political affiliation their families had. And, you know, chances are that's really strongly conditioned their worldview. And then go and engage with a group that's completely on the opposite end of the spectrum and find out what happens. Just watch what happens. Do your ABCs, explore your ABCs. Another one, obviously, is religion. This is this is a no-brainer in a way, because our brains are so disturbed by them, by their encounters with different ones. But this is an excellent source of a CDZ, and a great area for exploration of and discovery about cultural difference and worldview difference and things like that. So this is something oftentimes my students do, is they find a religious group that is, you know, polar opposite from their own, and they walk into it and they explore it, and they explore their ABCs around it. Also, there's gender identities, excellent source of cultural discomfort for some people. This is a drag show advertised by the Fitchburg State University, and it's coming up. So if anybody's on the East Coast, maybe you could check it out on April 5th. But you know, this is an area that, again, for many people is a cultural discomfort zone, and you know, gender identity is a big topic these days, and a beautiful area for exploring your ABCs and for learning about somebody else's worldview. Lastly, and this is the one that I think touches on the teacher's question, the elementary school teacher's question. This is an example of what we call virtual exchange. I have been since 2004, so 14 plus years now, involved with a nonprofit called Celia, which was set up in 2003 to create a possibility for very fertile interpersonal relationships between students from the United States, students from Europe, and students from Middle Eastern countries, predominantly Muslim countries. And so obviously, you know, given the news, given what's been going on in the world, and given the politics around it, this isn't just about the difference between, you know, Christianity and Islam. It's the difference between, you know, people who are raised in very, very different cultural traditions, who have misconceptions, sometimes deep misconceptions about the other. And so virtual exchange leverages computer-aided technology to connect up with people from another part of the world, create very exciting and intensive discussions with them in small groups. And it's an extraordinary way to encounter a cultural discomfort zone without actually leaving home. It doesn't have the full benefits of physically going somewhere, but it's remarkable how much cultural discomfort comes up when people are just interacting real time on a screen. Excuse me. And I bring that one up with regard to the K-5 thing because virtual exchange doesn't have to be fancy. It doesn't have to be set up by another company or another organization. We are using right now, thanks to Kendall Hunt, the technology called Zoom. Zoom is free for the first 40 minutes of your interaction. And in a typical classroom, 40 minutes is probably more than enough for a lot of people. And so you can set that up, host your own interactions with another place, another school, another country. Anybody who has an internet connection, a reliable internet connection can use Zoom nowadays to have very, very meaningful interactions with each other. So, back in the day, I remember when pen pals were really a big deal for schools, where kids in a school would write letters to other kids in another country and then exchange letters and learn about each other's ways of life and things like that. Virtual exchange kind of ramps that up and gives us the technology for face-to-face encounters real time with people who might, and from the standpoint of little kids, I would say, might become culturally uncomfortable for them later in life as they get more and more kind of entrenched in their own worldviews. But we can kind of disrupt that, if you will, at an early age by giving these opportunities for cross-cultural encounters that are incredibly meaningful. So I could go into more on that if you'd like in the Q&A, but I'm aware of the time, so I'm going to move on to the last bit. So this is that diagram that you saw in the front of my book. This is also on the e-poster that you'll be getting. And it's a symbolic representation of a journey, you could put it that way. And for each one, there's a little statement, a word that goes with it, and a little description. So I'm just going to walk us through in the time that remains, and then make sure I leave some time for questions. The first one is breathe. Settle your mind, open your mind, take stock. This is the mindfulness bit. And again, if you're new to mindfulness, if it doesn't make a lot of sense to you right now, I can go into that some more. You can get the book, check it out. What's kind of fun about the book is that it has QR codes you can zap with your phone, and it'll go right to a podcast that I created that has guided meditations, if you want to call that, or guided mindfulness exercises that engage you with some of the concepts in the book. So it's a great way to sort of try them out. And this is always what I recommend is when somebody's about to enter a cultural discomfort zone, is to breathe. Let your mind settle before you go in. Don't grab, we're all going to take baggage in, thanks to intergroup threat theories. Focus on that. But we don't have to take quite as much baggage in when we've had a chance to let our minds settle. And then there's enter. Step into your CDZ, embrace culture shock. That's why I have the red bit there, the red line coming out. The sun, by the way, is the self. That's in the center of the image. So that's where culture shock is first going to happen. That's also when we're at our most vigilant. This is oftentimes when freeze happens. We're surrounded by stuff that's so new that we're taking it all in. This is the time when I ask students to pay a special attention to their surroundings and to every aspect of the social environment and physical environment, because that's when they're going to be most aware of it. When you start to get used to it, your brain starts to kind of sift it out, and you sort of take it for granted. But your first encounter is when you're first going to be noticing a lot of information. Then we have wonder, and this is about curiosity. There's a lot of research that shows the more curious you are, obviously, while it killed the proverbial cat, it can teach us a lot about culture and about our own cultural matrix, and we can get the most out of our cultural discomfort. by investigating, as we're going to be seeing in a minute, but first starting with curiosity. So question everything, including your own perceptions and reactions. This is where you start to call everything into question. And again, that PDF that Ryan shared with you will unpack that and give you a better chance of a better way of understanding that. Then we get to investigate, deeply hang out. That's a term that an anthropologist used many years ago. It's another word for it is participant observation, but deeply hang out. That means fully, physically, cognitively, emotionally hang out. Take note of what's going on both inside and out. This is the investigation part. This is the part where we're paying close attention to our surroundings, but also to our ABCs. And then situate is very important. Put it all into perspective. Don't take it personally. This means that, as you're experiencing this cultural discomfort zone, you're going to be having all kinds of reactions to it, cognitive and otherwise. And a lot of times this is where people get shut down because they start to take it personally. They start to see that they get defensive, or they start to feel like they need to defend themselves, or in some way flee, avoid. But situating is a way to put things that you're learning into their cultural context. This is where you're digging down into history, if you will, or cultural traditions to understand where practices and values come from, so that you're able to contextualize your experience. Express means give voice to experience, tell a new story. So in this example, what I ask students to do is not tell the story through their own experience, but tell it as if it were somebody else's experience who belongs in that cultural matrix. It gives them a chance to use their imaginations, but also draw heavily from the experience they had and their efforts to situate their experience to give what they hope to be an authentic, as authentic as possible, representation of another person's reality, if you will. Lastly, we have respond. That's a picture of a drum. Deeply listen for resonance, attune. This is a key and last part. It's a cycle. As you see, it moves back to breathe. But respond is very important. Respond means that you are not just ending with your expression, because it turns out a lot of times we're wrong about what we think things mean, especially within another cultural context. And so respond means actually taking it to someone and seeing how it works with them, seeing how it connects with their experience and what you can learn from their reaction to it or their response to it. And then attune, meaning adapt, change, modify, edit what it is that you came up with, and therefore gain an even deeper understanding of your cultural experience. So those are the 7 steps to an ethno-wise path. And again, they are unpacked in much more detail in the PDF that you have that comes from my book. So at this point, since we're nearing the end, I think we have just a few minutes. I can take a few questions, so I'm happy to do that.
Thanks so much, Mike. I do have a few here if you're ready.
Great, I am ready.
All right, from a viewer, I'm interested in bringing out racist, sexist, and other tendencies in constructive ways. And cultural discomfort has been a fruitful path within learning communities. How do you work on this? Yeah,
that's such a great question. I guess I have 2 thoughts on that. One is, it comes from both of them come from this mindfulness practice area. It's a very important dimension of this. And what it means is, when I'm talking about ABCs and breathing, I'm really talking about cultivating your attention in a way that raises your awareness of your own reactions to things. And again, it's ABCs, so your own affective reactions, your own behavioral reactions, and cognitive reactions. So I think it's in some cases, when you're dealing with racism and sexism, it's less initially about the interactions you're having and more about exploring who you are, what your cultural conditioning is from a first person point of view. The second piece of that is about implicit bias. That's a big thing nowadays. The implicit bias, the implicit association test by Harvard has been called into question, but I believe that there's a fair amount of evidence that shows that bias exists on a sort of fluctuating landscape for us, and influences how we perceive the world and how we interact with other people. So today I might have a little less than I had yesterday, or a little more tomorrow, but it's still going to be a lens. It's still going to act as a lens through which I experience what we in anthropology have called the other. And that means that, you know, a lot of the conditioning I'm going to have from my background, from the way I was raised, is going to come to the fore in an unconscious way and influence what I say. It's going to influence what I'm thinking, the thoughts that are in my head. So in answer to that question, I think the important work is the personal work. I think there's a lot of contemplative work that can be done there, first person exploration of experience and conditioning, before even engaging with, you know, in a constructive, meaningful way with other people.
Great. How would you respond to students who do not want to encounter a group with different beliefs or values, where their identities may be challenged? For instance, hate groups, but there may be some more subtle examples.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is where we get, well, and my knee-jerk reaction to that, my reaction, is that, you know, we need to be able to differentiate realistic from symbolic threat. Hate groups are not appropriate cultural discomfort zones to explore, because they mean you harm. And sometimes it's physical harm, not just emotional or psychological harm. So I think we have to take it slow. I think when there's a student who's very, you know, very unsettled and very nervous about going into a cultural discomfort zone, what I recommend is taking it easy, starting really small. So, you know, there's culture, like I mentioned before, there's cultural discomfort around food. We don't have to go any farther than food, you know, or some other small way, because really it's about growing that resilience. It's not about jumping into the deep end of the pool. So I think it's important to start small, and with students who are really hesitant, and they may have very good reasons for that. So we don't want to trigger them into a traumatic experience, or reliving a traumatic experience just for the sake of an exercise. We start small. We start very, very simply, and you know, cater it to the needs of the student and where they're at in their life.
Great. We are getting lots of interest about the book. Really good discussions on the chat as well. Someone suggested the book Deviate, The Science of Seeing Differently by Olato. So,
Nice.
And I will be sending out information on your publication. How easy have you made it to adopt this book? What material have you developed to make adoption of this easy?
Well, in the book itself, there are more exercises than you would ever want to see. So just about every page you turn has a suggested way of exploring an idea in there, and all of them are, if you will, hands-on, in the sense of really trying them out through thought experiments and also through direct experience. So it's just chock full of those kinds of things. Also, there's the podcast type things, so you can jump right in using the QR codes to try out some of these meditations, these attentional explorations. And then, in addition, what I've offered people is, and right now I'm currently able to do this, and we may have to structure a little bit more as the demand mounts, but I'm certainly willing to consult with people on this through Zoom. You know, through an initial consultation to kind of set the stage, if you will, for any kind of curriculum development or exercises that you want to try to implement.
So exciting. Thank you so much, Mike. I will be following up, everyone, with a copy of the e-poster that Mike had discussed, and a link to the recording of this webinar. Once again, thank you so much, Mike. I really love William Drury's quote. I'm going to add that to my list. I love that quote. It's so meaningful.
Yep, stayed with me my whole life.
It's a keeper, for sure.
Yes, it is.
So once again, thank you for spending the last hour with us. I truly appreciate it, and look forward to the next one in the future.
Thanks, everybody, for joining me, and do get in touch if you want to talk more about these subjects. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.